I have spent most of my life watching people misunderstand what makes a fortune durable. A great many men think the danger arrives when income falls. That is not usually how it happens. The real danger often arrives years earlier, when income is still rising, when the house looks solid, when the children are doing well, when the vacations still happen, when the car still starts in the driveway, and when the man at the center of it all is absolutely convinced he is doing fine. That is the trap: not being visibly broke, not being ruined in public, looking stable while the gap between what you earn and what you are building widens every single month. The average 53-year-old American man has only $87,000 saved for retirement, and half have less than that. The number shocks people because it collides with the picture they carry in their head. They imagine middle age as the decade when everything starts paying off. They imagine that by then the income is finally strong, the career finally established, the house finally respectable, and the sacrifice of the earlier years finally converting into freedom. But what I have seen over and over is that the decade people call their peak can become the most financially dangerous decade of their lives. That is especially true for men in their 50s. By that point, a man has usually built enough outward proof of success to feel safe, but he has also built enough obligations to become fragile. He thinks he owns his life because the symbols of ownership are all around him. In reality, the symbols often own him. The image I would use for this is not a trophy. It is an anchor, not a rusty anchor hidden below the deck. A golden one, a massive, impressive, polished golden anchor. People can see it from the dock. They know it was expensive, they know it took years of work to acquire, they admire it, they associate it with stability, they assume it represents security. But an anchor is only useful under the right conditions. When the tide is calm, it holds you in place. When the tide rises against you, it still holds you in place, and that can be the thing that kills you. Your mortgage can be a golden anchor. Your fixed monthly obligations can be a golden anchor. Your professional identity can be a golden anchor. Your car lease can be a golden anchor. Your tuition commitments can be a golden anchor. Your club dues can be a golden anchor. The lifestyle you built to prove you had arrived can be a chain made of golden anchors linked together, one obligation at a time. That is why I have never judged wealth by appearances. Appearances are expensive. Appearances charge rent. Appearances create monthly commitments that do not care how you feel, what the market does. Whether your health changes, whether your employer restructures, whether your parents need care, whether your children need launch capital, or whether your marriage survives the decade. A man can be making more money than he ever imagined and still be moving backwards. In fact, that is one of the most common patterns I know, somewhere in the late 40s and sometimes a little earlier. The psychology shifts in youth. A man thinks in terms of expansion. He asks what he can build, he asks what he can pursue, he asks how far he can go. Then, without making a formal announcement to himself, he begins to think defensively. He stops asking what he can build and starts asking what he must maintain. That feels mature. It feels responsible. It feels like adulthood. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is one of the most expensive mental transitions a man can make, because he is no longer protecting wealth. He is protecting the appearance of wealth, and the appearance of wealth is one of the costliest assets in America. I want you to picture how this usually happens, because the disaster is rarely caused by one wild decision. It is usually caused by 25 years of reasonable ones. A house purchased when rates felt manageable. A second car because the children needed transportation and the household was busy. A more prestigious neighborhood because it seemed better for schools and networking. A vacation property rationalized as an investment. Private school tuition that began when the children were young and then became socially impossible to reverse. A country club membership that looked like career insurance. Subscription services. Nobody reviews. Insurance premiums on old purchases. Nobody remembers. A cleaning service, a lawn service, a more expensive social circle. Each choice clears the same simple mental test. Can I afford the monthly payment? That is one of the most dangerous questions in personal finance. It sounds prudent, but it is shallow. It is not a wealth question. It is a cash flow question. It only asks whether the checking account can survive the present month. It says almost nothing about whether the household is building future independence. That is how a man ends up spending $3,000 a month on obligations that look ordinary on a statement and quietly destroy the compounding that could have made him free. On a bank statement, $3,000 going to car payments and $3,000 going into productive retirement assets occupy the same amount of visual space. In real life, they do opposite things. One buys motion without freedom. The other buys freedom without applause. I think about a man like Richard. Richard is 51. He is a regional sales director at a manufacturing company. He makes $190,000 a year. That is more than his father made. It is more than he imagined he would make when he was 28. By ordinary social standards, Richard is a success. But his mortgage payment, including taxes and insurance, is $4,200 a month. He leases a BMW for $750 a month because after working this hard he wanted to drive something he actually liked. He owns a boat he uses a handful of times each year. Financing and storage together take another $700 or so a month. He belongs to a country club that costs $450 a month. And if you asked him why, he would honestly tell you it helps his professional network. He has 2 children in private high school at $22,000 per year each. Before Richard buys groceries, before he fills the gas tank, before he goes to dinner, before he pays for anything discretionary at all, he is already committed to roughly $12,500 a month in fixed obligations. After taxes, he brings home about $10,600 a month. That means he is effectively underwater before ordinary life even starts. Richard is not reckless. He is not foolish. He is the product of 2.5 decades of individually defensible decisions stacked without a single honest calculation of what they became in aggregate. That total, that monthly floor, that minimum cost just to stay still, that is the number almost nobody wants to face. I call it the burn rate. And in middle age, the burn rate tells more truth than income does. A high income with a broken burn rate is not strength. It is a temporary illusion. I have watched many households where income doubled over 15 years while wealth barely moved. People talk as if those are almost the same thing. They are not the same thing at all. Income can rise while financial freedom falls. Earnings can grow while optionality disappears. A household can look richer every year while becoming less capable of absorbing shock. That is what the 50s reveal. They reveal whether income was converted into capital or merely converted into a lifestyle, expensive enough to imprison the earner. That is why so many people with large paychecks report the same stress as people with much smaller ones. The track is just priced differently. The pressure feels the same because the structure is wrong, and the structure matters more than the motivational slogans. You do not solve a structural problem with pep talks. You do not solve it with a prettier spreadsheet. You do not solve it by pretending the market will bail you out. You solve it by cutting anchors. If a man at 40 had redirected even one modest luxury, say $800 a month, into a low-cost index fund, compounding around 7% until 65, he could create roughly $472,000 from that single decision, not from genius, not from a breakthrough stock pick, not from perfect timing, simply from not buying one anchor and letting time do what it does best. That sounds obvious when said plainly. It is almost invisible while it is happening. Now the next danger is even less visible, and it ruins people who think they have finally become disciplined savers. Most men think their retirement problem is a savings problem. Sometimes it is, but often the deeper problem is that they have never asked what happens to whatever they did, save if the order of returns turns against them. This is the part the average person ignores because it sounds technical. I never ignore it because it destroys fortunes without making a sound until it is too late. If you are 58, sitting on $450,000 planning to retire at 63, and the market gives you 5 decent years at roughly 7%, you may walk into retirement with something like $630,000. That looks clean, orderly, predictable. Now change one variable, let the market drop 35% in the first year of retirement. After that, let it recover and even produce strong returns over the next 19 years. On paper, the arithmetic average may still look acceptable. That is the lie people fall in love with, because arithmetic averages do not retire. Human beings do. The retiree is not observing the portfolio from a distance while it recovers untouched. He is withdrawing from it while it is wounded. He is selling shares at depressed prices to cover groceries, utilities, insurance, travel to medical appointments, and ordinary life. He is pulling cash from a shrunken base during the exact years when the base most needed to remain whole. That changes everything. A portfolio that looks adequate in a straight line can fail badly if the sequence breaks against you at the wrong moment. That is not theory. People who retired into the 2008 collapse discovered it in real life. Their accounts were cut down at the precise moment when they became most dependent on them. The market eventually recovered. Their specific retirement path often did not, because drawdowns during the trough locked in damage that time alone could not erase. When I evaluate a retirement plan, I do not want to know only what happens if returns average out nicely. I want to know what happens if the first 2 years are ugly. I want to know whether the plan survives a bruising beginning. If it survives only under smooth assumptions, it is not a plan. It is hope decorated with numbers. That brings me to Gary. Gary is 54. He has done what a great many conscientious men do. He hired a respected wealth management firm years ago. He trusted the quarterly reports. He accepted the 80-20 allocation. He looked at the charts long enough to feel engaged and then returned to his life. He knew he was not perfect, but he believed he was basically on track. Gary had $600,000 under management. He also paid an advisory fee of 1.2% per year. Most people hear that and shrug. Basis points do not trigger emotion. They are designed not to. But the market does not care whether a drag on compounding feels small. A drag is a drag on a $600,000 portfolio growing at 7%. The difference between paying 1.2% and paying just a few basis points for a broad index approach compounds into an astonishing transfer of future wealth. Over 15 years, you can easily be talking about roughly $182,000. That is not a footnote. That is a real section of a retirement life. And yet people will argue about a restaurant bill for 10 minutes and hand away 6 figures of compounding because it arrived in fractions too small to sting in a single quarter. I am not cynical about advisors. I do not think most are villains, but I do understand incentives. Incentives matter in every business. If a strategy involves moving assets away from the structure that produces the advisor's compensation, you should not be shocked if that strategy gets less attention. That is why Gary, despite being in the system for years, was never seriously guided through Roth conversions at the moment they could matter most. Done correctly during a lower tax bracket transition, that kind of move can save large sums over retirement. It is not exotic. It is not magic. It is simply the kind of thing that gets lost when the machine is optimized around asset management more than around total life design. But Gary's real trouble did not come from fees alone. Middle age has a way of sending multiple bills to the same house at the same time. This is what younger men underestimate. They think risk arrives one issue at a time. It does not. It clusters. The first cluster is often aging parents. A man can spend his 40s thinking his financial life is finally stabilizing, only to learn in his early 50s that stability was built on the assumption that his parents would not need large ongoing support. Then memory care enters the picture, assisted living enters the picture, medical transportation enters the picture. A quiet family conversation becomes a recurring monthly transfer. Medicare covers some things. It does not cover everything that aging eventually demands. A household can move from abstract concern to a $5,000, $6,000, or $7,000 monthly reality in a hurry. If the parent has modest savings, that cushion can vanish within a year or so. Then the family becomes the balance sheet. Gary's mother needed memory care. The cost ran around $6,200 a month. She had some savings, not nearly enough for the duration of the problem. Gary ended up covering roughly $3,000 a month. Not forever in theory, of course. But financial trouble is often disguised by that phrase. Not forever can still mean for years. That was another anchor Gary did not expect. Then comes the second cluster, adult children. Not the cost of diapers and school lunches. The cost of launch. A man can think he is approaching the finish line only to discover that the final education years are not a small family chapter, but a capital event. If you have children at 16 and 18 and you have not fully funded the education path ahead, you are not looking at a minor line item. You are looking at an enormous transfer of post-tax resources over a concentrated period of time. Tuition, room, board, fees, books, flights, apartments, the hidden costs no brochure leads with. The bill rarely arrives as a clean total. It arrives as a stream that makes it emotionally easier to tolerate and financially easier to underestimate. Then comes the third cluster, late divorce. I do not say this for drama. I say it because men in their 50s are often financially exposed in a way men in their 30s are not. At 34, you are dividing what you started building at 53. You can be dividing what your whole adult life was pointed toward: retirement accounts, home equity, legal fees, support payments, asset sales. The forced liquidation of a life structure built over decades. The emotional disruption comes precisely when judgment is least dependable. Gary was separated while all the other pressures were already active. So now picture the full picture. A man in his mid-50s, advisory fees quietly compounding against him. Sequence risk never honestly modeled. $3,000 a month going to a parent. A child about to begin college. A marriage under strain. And behind all of it, a burn rate he had never really faced. That is not a sensational story. It is a common one. It is what happens when each piece of the financial picture is reviewed in isolation, and nobody sits the household down to say the obvious hard truth. Your fixed obligations are too high. Your fee structure is draining compounding. Your retirement plan assumes a gentle market. Your concurrent cash demands are heavier than your current system can bear. That conversation is hard. It is much harder than talking about rebalancing. It is much harder than showing a pie chart. It is much harder than saying everyone is dealing with volatility. But without that conversation, a man can remain financially polite all the way into disaster. Now there is one more force that deserves to be treated with the seriousness it earns: professional identity. By 50, a man is not merely earning. He is known. He is the managing director, the founding partner, the man who built a division, the operator who rescued a business, the executive everyone calls, the entrepreneur people introduce with admiration. That identity is real. It often took decades to build. It is also expensive. The neighborhood becomes part of the identity. The car becomes part of the identity. The club becomes part of the identity. The watch, the school, the vacations, the stories casually told at dinner, all of it becomes part of the identity. Each one is a signal. Signals are not free. In fact, many households are silently organized around the maintenance of signals. There is no disclosure form for this. No quarterly line item called status maintenance. No accountant circles it in red and says this category is consuming your future. That is why it works so well. It does its damage while feeling socially intelligent. I think about two men from the same business school class, call one Paul and the other Marcus. Both went into finance. Both made similar money by 52. Both were earning about $220,000 a year. Paul maintained what a lot of people would call the right footprint, the right suburb, the right car, private school, country club, international family trips expensive enough to sound tasteful. He looked like a man who had done well, and socially he was rewarded for looking that way. But beneath that appearance, he was leaning on home equity to close the gap between his income and his lifestyle. Each individual expense was defensible. That is the problem with these traps. They do not usually arrive wearing a villain's face. They arrive wearing the face of reasonableness. Paul had several $100,000 in retirement accounts and some home equity, but his true liquid net worth, the money that could actually buy freedom without selling the house, was far smaller than people around him imagined. Marcus made different choices, not joyless ones, deliberate ones. He lived in a good district, not the prestige district. He drove a used car he owned outright. He traveled, but not every year at the level expected by his peers. He consistently maxed retirement contributions. When catch-up contributions became available, he used them. He directed money to a simple, low-cost portfolio. He chose optionality over applause. By his early 50s, his investable assets and liquid flexibility were in an altogether different category from Paul S., despite the similar income. Same profession, same decade, same broad market, completely different outcome. One bought approval, the other bought options. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in middle age. Approval cannot pay you when you are tired. Approval cannot fund health care. Approval cannot absorb sequence risk. Approval cannot give you the ability to leave a job that begins to hollow you out. Approval cannot purchase time. Options can. That is why I care so much about the number nobody wants to calculate, the burn rate. A man earning $180,000 with fixed obligations of $11,000 per month is not in the same universe as a man earning the same amount with fixed obligations of $6,000. Their tax return may look similar. Their retirement future does not. One is running a deficit or hovering at zero before life begins. The other is creating investable surplus month after month over 15 years. That difference can separate a man scraping together a modest sum from a man building more than $1 million of additional capital. Same income, same market, same period, different structure. People love to blame the market, inflation, taxes, and politics for everything. Those things matter, but structure sits underneath all of them. If your burn rate is broken, favorable markets merely delay the truth. If your burn rate is sound, bad markets hurt but do not automatically destroy you. This is what Gary finally had to confront after the divorce settled. His house was gone. Roughly half the retirement account was gone. The investable asset base was badly reduced. The original dream of retiring at 62 was no longer realistic. A great many men would treat that as the end of the story. It was not the end. It was the first honest chapter. Gary moved to a smaller apartment. He brought his fixed monthly obligations down from around $9,500 to about $4,100. He left the expensive advisory arrangement. He shifted into a simple three-fund structure with very low ongoing costs. He began Roth conversions during a lower bracket period. Did that erase the damage? Number, did it restore the fantasy? Number, did it cut the anchor? Yes, and cutting the anchor matters more than preserving the story you used to tell yourself. He may not retire at 62, he may have to work to 68. But there is a profound difference between delayed freedom and total financial submersion. One still leaves you with agency, the other leaves you with drift. When I talk to men in this stage of life, I try to get them away from vanity metrics and back to honest ones. I do not care whether the neighborhood approves of the driveway. I care whether the household can survive a bad market. I do not care whether the club membership feels like status. I care whether that monthly money should have been buying compounding. I do not care whether an advisor uses sophisticated language. I care what the fee drag is over 15 years. I do not care whether a retirement projection looks elegant in a favorable scenario. I care what happens if the first years are ugly. I do not care whether the lifestyle feels normal among peers. I care what percentage of take-home income is already spoken for before breakfast. That is how adults should think about financial resilience. Not by asking whether a purchase feels deserved, not by asking whether the payment technically clears, not by asking whether everybody else in the circle is doing the same thing, by asking whether the decision increases future optionality or reduces it. That one question clears away an astonishing amount of nonsense. Will this buy me options or obligations? Will this make the household more anti-fragile or more brittle? Will this reduce the future burn rate or lock it in? Will this increase capital or merely increase maintenance? Once you start thinking that way, the world changes. You begin to see that a polished obligation is still an obligation. You begin to see that the things most admired in middle age are often the least useful in retirement. You begin to see that modest-looking habits, done consistently, can outperform flamboyant success. And you begin to understand why the men who arrive at 60 with real freedom are often not the men who looked richest at 52. They are the men who did the arithmetic while everyone else was doing theater. There is no glamour in that sentence, but there is a lot of truth. The arithmetic matters. If your fixed obligations exceed 60% of take-home pay, you have a structural problem. If your retirement survives only under smooth market assumptions, you have a structural problem. If your investment costs are high enough to siphon six figures from a long compounding period, you have a structural problem. If your plan ignores aging parents, adult children, or the possibility of relationship disruption, you have a structural problem. And structure problems do not respond to motivational talk. They respond to redesign. That redesign is often emotionally painful because the things that need to be reduced are usually tied to identity. You may need to sell the boat you once believed symbolized success. You may need to leave the club that made you feel included. You may need to move to a smaller house that your ego dislikes. You may need to drive the car that does not impress anyone. You may need to say no to helping adult children in the socially expected way and instead help them in the financially survivable way. You may need to question whether a fee arrangement that seemed harmless is quietly taking a meaningful slice of your future. You may need to confront a marriage, a family pattern, or a professional posture that was affordable only under assumptions that no longer exist. That is not easy. But what is the alternative? To keep polishing the anchor while the water rises. I have seen that movie. It ends the same way far too often. The tragedy is not that men are foolish. The tragedy is that the trap is built out of things that once felt earned, that makes them hard to classify as liabilities. A mortgage on the home that proved you made it. A car after 20 years of effort. Tuition for children you love. A social circle that helped your career, professional prestige that took decades to accumulate. These do not feel like enemies. That is why they are so effective when they become weights. When I say that middle age is dangerous, I do not mean it is doomed. I mean it is revealing. It reveals whether what you built was a machine that can carry you or a stage set that must constantly be propped up. It reveals whether the household runs on capital or on performance. It reveals whether the man earning the money still has the power to change course or whether he has become an employee of his own overhead. That may be the hardest sentence in this whole conversation. So I will say it plainly, a great many men are not employed by their companies. They are employed by their own burn rate. The job is simply where they go each day to feed it. Once you see that, the path forward becomes much clearer. First, you must know the floor. Not the aspirational budget, not the optimistic version, the real floor: mortgage or rent, car payments, insurance, tuition, dues, minimum debt service, ongoing support to family. Recurring obligations that require more than one easy phone call to stop. Add them honestly. That is the amount the world charges you just to stay still. Then you compare it to take-home income. If the share is too high, the problem is not that you need more discipline. It is that you need a different structure. Second, you stress test the future. Do not ask only what happens if the market averages out nicely. Ask what happens if retirement begins into a storm. Ask what happens if the first years are negative. Ask what happens if you are drawing down while scared. The answer may be uncomfortable. Good uncomfortable answers are often the first honest ones. Third, you inspect every fee and every friction point in the financial system around you. Not because all paid advice is bad. Not because simplicity is a religion, but because compounding is relentless, and every recurring cost compounds too. Some costs are worth paying, some are simply rents extracted from inattention. Fourth, and this may be the hardest, you separate your identity from your overhead. You are not the car, you are not the neighborhood, you are not the school invoice, you are not the club, you are not the image of a successful man presented to other successful men. You are the steward of a balance sheet that either buys freedom or consumes it. That is the adult way to see it. Not glamorous, accurate. I have also learned that lazy investing beats theatrical investing more often than people want to admit. Automatic contributions, broad, low-cost funds, patience, refusal to tinker, refusal to confuse action with intelligence. None of that makes for exciting dinner conversation. But excitement is not the point. Wealth is the point. Optionality is the point. The ability to reach 62, 65, or 68. With real choices is the point. The men still grinding at 67. In jobs they do not enjoy, often looked impressive 15 years earlier. The men who step away earlier and quietly often looked less dramatic during their earning years. That is because one group bought visible success and the other group bought invisible resilience. Invisible resilience is hard to market. It is also the thing that matters when the tide comes in. So if I were sitting across from a 53-year-old man with a decent income, a respectable house, children doing reasonably well, a retirement balance that looks better than nothing but worse than it should, and a mind telling him he is probably fine, I would not begin with reassurance. I would begin with arithmetic. I would say that your future is not being decided by how successful you look. It is being decided by whether you can still convert earnings into capital. It is being decided by whether your obligations are low enough to let compounding work. It is being decided by whether you understand sequence risk before sequence risk understands you. It is being decided by whether fees, family demands, education costs, and identity maintenance are being treated as real claims on future freedom. It is being decided by whether you have the courage to cut one golden anchor after another before the water gets to your chin. That is not pessimism. That is responsibility. And responsibility, properly understood, is not protecting the appearance of wealth. It is protecting the capacity to become free. The window between now and retirement may be smaller than you think. That is true, but it is also more valuable than you think. That is true too. A lot can still change in 12 years. A lot can still change in 10. Even in 7 or 8, a household that stops performing and starts calculating can alter its trajectory. The man who reduces fixed obligations, lowers fee drag models, real risk, stops buying status, and redirects surplus into compounding may not feel richer next month. He may feel embarrassed next month. He may feel smaller in the eyes of people who were never going to finance his retirement anyway. But over time, if he stays with it, he becomes something much more important than impressive. He becomes hard to sink. That is what I would want for any man entering the second half of life. Not a shinier anchor, not a better story about the anchor, not a more expensive dock full of other people comparing anchors. I would want him to cut what must be cut, own what truly produces freedom, and walk into old age with enough capital, enough simplicity, and enough self-command that the tide can rise without taking him under. That is not a flashy ambition. It is a wise one, and wisdom in money as in life is often nothing more than the willingness to stop polishing what is heavy and start protecting what floats.